So, when you were at Sunday school or you're at church or whatever and they looked at 1 Samuel 17, well, this is what continues. You probably didn't go on and look at this. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul, with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and tambourines and lutes, and as they danced, they sang this song that went international. I'm not kidding. You're going to see later on at key points in David's life, this song keeps coming back to haunt him. And it wasn't just in Israel, it was in some of the countries around Israel as well. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They've credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaign. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I'll not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my family or my father's clan in Israel, that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. "I'll give her to him," he thought, "so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." So Saul said to David, "Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law." And then Saul ordered his attendants, "Speak to David privately and say, 'Look, the king is pleased with you, and his attendants, all like you, now become his son-in-law.'" They repeated these words to David, but David said, "Do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known." When Saul's servants told him what David had said, Saul replied, "Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride." Now we're moving to X-rated territory. "Wants no other price for the bride than," let me look. I looked away from my thing and now I'm looking down. "Than 100 Philistine foreskins," there we go, "to take revenge on his enemies." Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins, how gross is this, and presented the full number to the king. Don't know what they did with them, so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. Okay, here's what we're going to call this next teaching session: success and suffering. It's going to come up again, don't worry. And I want to just first of all look at how high profile David becomes. How highly successful David becomes. You could at some point read again through 1 Samuel 18 on your own and underline, shade through, highlight how many references there are to success, more successful, great success, so successfully. This, without doubt, is the key theme in 1 Samuel 18. It is the repeated word. And David is, first of all, highly successful professionally. He is the future king of Israel. That's already happened in private with Samuel. Arise, anoint him, he is the one, and he pours the oil on David's head. But you also have in 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 4, Jonathan was the eldest son of Saul. So Jonathan is the king in waiting from a human point of view. You know, if David had never been anointed, when Saul died, Jonathan would have become the king. And it says in verse 4, Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. These are the trappings of royalty that he's giving to David. This is Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise, taking the pips off his shoulder and giving them to a younger officer who now puts them on and starts wearing them. It's obvious that David, at least in some people's eyes, is marked out for greatness. 1 Samuel 23 verse 17, we're going to visit this later on. Don't be afraid, Jonathan said. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You shall be king over Israel. So he's really climbing the ladder towards his destiny. Also, he's promoted. 1 Samuel 18:5. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This is David now. He's not a corporal, and I'm not minimizing being a corporal. He's not a sergeant. David is the equivalent of a major or a colonel in the armies of Israel. I don't know if you ever watch these movies where people are in army dress. Then you have somebody like Bruce Willis, and he stood there, and he's just dressed impeccably, and he's got all these medals, etc. This is David. David is put in charge of a third of Saul's elite forces. 1 Samuel 18 verse 13. So he, Saul, sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. If you're to just look at this time in history, it seems as though there were 3 elite regiments, each of whom had 1,000 men. Just trust me on that. And David is given command over one of these elite groups of soldiers. David does twice as much as he needed to do. We have this whole gross deal that we looked at about 100 Philistine foreskins. What's that about? That's gross. Well, Saul wants evidence that David has killed these Philistine soldiers. And unlike the Israelites, the Philistines were uncircumcised, and so they come up with this brilliant idea. Now, newsflash, most soldiers are not that keen on being separated from their foreskins. So David is being sent. That's a light relief, but don't worry. David is being sent out to kill 100. What does he do? What's it say? So before the allotted time elapsed, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. And so David now is becoming recognized wherever he goes. 1 Samuel 18, verse 23. This is David's view of himself. When the attendants of Saul are coming and kind of saying, well, you know, we have Saul's ear and he tells us stuff, etc., and he wants you to kill these 100 Philistines, they repeated these words to David, but David said, do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. Look what it says at the end of the chapter that we read, 1 Samuel 18, verse 30. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. So David is professionally moving up the ranks. This is like you going home from Bible school and you go back to Walmart where you're stacking shelves, or you go back to Starbucks where you're, dispensing coffee. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then within weeks, you are now the CEO of a major company, despite what Bill Gates said that we read out earlier on. You now have a Porsche 911. Your face is in all the advertising hoardings. That's what happens to David. It's very easy, because it's a different culture, for us not to realize how high profile this guy becomes. He then also becomes highly successful relationally. He's on the inner track with the prince. Saul's eldest son, Jonathan. It says 1 Samuel 18, verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. We're going to look at this. Are they gay in a minute, okay? Let's just say it and then put it on the back burner and move on. We are going to look at that in a minute. I mean, this is kind of weird stuff, isn't it? When Jonathan, who was probably in his 40s, and David, who's now just turned 20 or something, and Jonathan is giving him these intimate clothing. I mean, what is that about? One of the things I've realized is that we give precious things and intimate things and things that are in a window to who the person is for somebody that we really love. I get the best gifts at Christmas from those who really love me. So, I have a number of heroes, and one of my heroes is a guy called George Mallory. Anybody heard of George Mallory? Okay. George Mallory was probably the first man to climb Everest in 1924. He tried to climb it on 2 previous occasions, and a group had gone back, and they had such primitive equipment, it was almost a joke. They would have like tweed jackets and gloves they bought on the local market, and they're trying to climb Everest. Well, George Mallory and his friend Sandy Irvine were last seen on the final slope of Everest through a big telescope. And then the clouds rolled in, and when the clouds rolled out, they could no longer be seen. And they were never seen again until fairly recently. And so I'm sure he made it to the top. And I'm personally sure he made it to the top because he said that he always carried a photograph of his wife Ruth with him. And he said when he made it to the top, he would put her photograph on the summit. Well, fairly recently, a team of climbing historians went looking for the body of George Mallory. And they found it. They found it frozen into the snow slope. It's an incredible discovery. And they went through his pockets, and because it was so cold there, all the stuff in his pockets was perfectly preserved. So there was a tin of sardines, some matches, a compass, but no photograph. And so my own view is they fell on the way down, not on the way up. Now, my daughter Abby has heard me tell that story loads of times. And very recently I got a book for Christmas from Abby. And it was called The Ghosts of Everest. And it was talking about the search for Mallory's body. And what really moved me and moves me was what Abby wrote on the flyleaf. And she wrote, to one of my heroes. Yeah. People who know you the most give you the most beautiful gifts. Not the most expensive gifts, but the gifts that are a window into your heart. And here David is being given these clothes by the elder son of Saul. He's in a track with the prince. In our kind of culture, he would be on all the talk shows. I was just watching last night with my friend the BAFTA Awards, the British Film Industry's awards for Best Actor, Best Actress, etc. And usually, people in any arena value the recognition of their peers. So in football, one of the most valued awards is when players vote for their player of the year. Well, look at what it says in 1 Samuel 18, verse 5. That Saul gave David a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. All of David's fellow officers were thrilled that he's now a colonel in the Israeli army. He is the guest of honor at a rock concert. I'm just bringing this stuff into our culture, that's all. So we already looked at this, didn't we? 1 Samuel 18, verse 6. When the men were returning home, after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul. With singing, with dancing, with joyful songs, tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. That sounds all kind of twee and nice, and lutes and all the rest of it, like some Elizabethan garden singing. It wasn't like that at all. This is like, a rock concert in Hyde Park. This is U2 and Bono singing a song written especially for David. I mean, the guy is becoming incredibly high profile. He's a national hero. 1 Samuel 18:16. All Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. I don't know in your country who are the sporting men or women who really capture the heart of your nation. I know in the UK, when we have a sportsman or a sportswoman who begins to lead a team or be part of a team that starts to whoop everybody all over the world, boy, they're on the front page of all the newspapers. Here is a prophecy from Rob Whittaker, right? England are going to win in Japan later this year the Rugby Union World Cup. End of prophecy. All right? And when that happens, some of those guys who are playing will be all over the newspapers. Anybody here from France before I upset anybody? Really sorry about this. But England played France on Saturday and absolutely obliterated them. And I heard somebody say something, I thought, that is incredible. Do you know what the coach of the England team says? I don't know if you've seen rugby, it's like American football, but without all the stuff to protect you. It's big guys crashing into each other. If you get knocked down playing for England, you have to be up and running within 3 seconds, or the coach will take you off the team. How about that? Well, David is kind of the equivalent of the captain of the team that's winning. And everybody is just thinking the guy's awesome. And then to top it all off, he gets married to a princess. It's kind of moving, isn't it? Saul's already pulled a fast one. He doesn't get married to Saul's eldest daughter. He gets married to one of the ones further down, Michal. Says verse 20, now Michal, Saul's daughter, was in love with David. And then verse 27, then Saul gave him his daughter in marriage. This marriage would not be some little backstreet affair. It's kind of funny, in England we have a magazine called Hello magazine. And if ever you're going to fly to Australia or somewhere, you're on a long flight, as you're getting on the plane, they are giving you a whole choice of things. You know, there's the Times newspaper, the Financial Times, the Sun newspaper, and Hello magazine. And it's really funny because folk who pick up Hello magazine always do it kind of a bit embarrassed, you know. Financial Times, you know, this is me, big time business person, you know. But Hello magazine, this is kind of tucked out of sight. Because it's a full colour magazine and it is world coverage of all the big and the great, you know, important people. And they'll often have an exclusive on some marriage somewhere. So when David Beckham gets married, there's a 15-page supplement. Probably paid him and Posh Spice millions of quid for that. Well, David, this elite leader in the armies of Israel, everybody knows him, is marrying this princess, the younger daughter of Saul. It would have been all over Hello magazine. So David is highly successful professionally, he's highly successful relationally, and he's highly successful spiritually. There are a couple of statements that we looked at. Chapter 18, verse 12. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. Or verse 14 of chapter 18. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. Chapter 18, verse 28. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David. Now, I wonder what you think that means when we read the Lord was with David. It doesn't mean David was religious. It doesn't mean David had a little badge on, you know, me religious kind of thing. It wasn't that David had a quiet time. You know, the Lord was with David, he had a quiet time. I'm not knocking having a quiet time, by the way. It sounds like it, but I'm not. What it means was that there was something measurably, observably, tangibly visible about David. I have met people like that. And when I use the word charisma, I don't mean it like charismatic in terms of spiritual gifts and stuff. I mean it in the way that the world normally means it. I don't know if you've ever met anybody like that. You're in their presence and the Lord is with them. It's obvious. You almost get goosebumps when you're around them. Now, we've seen this with Samuel. Let me just read you some things about Samuel. 1 Samuel 3, 19 through 20. We looked at this last week. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. Something we didn't look at in chapter 16, when Samuel goes to Bethlehem, we know, to anoint the future king. Look at what it says, 1 Samuel 16, verse 4. Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" The people were kind of, whoa, God's with this guy. This guy's special. Well, let me read you something from later on that we will look at. 1 Samuel 21, verse 1. David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met David and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" Now, part of that could be a sneaky suspicion, hey, what's going on between David and Saul? But I think also here is a sense of, this is a man of God that I'm speaking to. So I wonder how you think it would feel to wake up and be David every morning. Just imagine this was you, highly successful professionally, highly successful relationally, highly successful. spiritually. Well, do you remember what we said last week? Said we were going to revisit. For every new level, there is a new devil. And David is not only highly successful, but now he begins to experience some of the pressures that are going to mount and mount and mount and mount, and from a human point of view, almost kill him in the next 20-some years. For every new level, there is a new devil. Look what somebody else said. Don't let your gifting take you where your character won't keep you. There are lots and lots of people just in the secular world who are incredibly gifted. And yet their gifting and their success puts them in a position where their character isn't strong enough to keep them on the straight and narrow. And there are so many people you could think of who fall into that category. I think, for instance, of dear Michael Jackson. What a phenomenal dancer. I've seen that guy on a DVD. I've seen him walk onto a stage. And just the way he walked, the elegance, the fluency with which he moved, sent shivers down my back. Seeing him dancing, incredible dancer, unbelievably talented. And yet that puts him into a situation that his character isn't strong enough to hold him. Or Whitney Houston, or a score of other people. Thank God that David, most of the time, has a character that's strong enough to keep him. So let's have a look at some of the pressures that come upon David. First of all, David suffered the heartbreak of an unfulfilled friendship. I don't know if you've thought about this, but he and Jonathan had the potential for an awesome friendship. We read already, didn't we? Chapter 18, verse 1. After David had finished talking to Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David and loved him as he loved himself. 1 Samuel 18, verse 3. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as he loved himself. We've said this before, that awesome friendships are built on having a great deal in common with the person who's your friend. I'll say that one more time. Awesome friendships are built on having a great deal in common with the person who is your friend. And you can maybe just write a little question in your notes. You can maybe write down the question, what did David and Jonathan have in common? There's a whole bunch of stuff that they had in common. Both of them are incredible soldiers. Both of them loved it when the odds were stacked against them. Both of them really trusted the Lord. And surprise, surprise, both of them respected and honored the position of the king. They've so much in common. And you're thinking, oh, this is fantastic. Except their friendship was never really fulfilled. They spend very, very little time together between now and the time of Jonathan's death at the end of 1 Samuel. They could have had a fantastic relationship. Singing together, drinking coffee, planning adventures. It would have been fantastic. But they spend hardly any time together. Why? Because life is very complicated. You say, Rob, I don't get what you mean. Well, there is one thing that stops Jonathan and David having a great friendship, which is experienced and developed. And it is Saul. Saul increasingly hates David. And Jonathan has to choose between Saul and David. And I think Jonathan is an incredible guy. I think he's one of the unsung heroes of the Old Testament, where he decides to honor his dad. And as much as he possibly can, support his dad. And so right at the end of 1 Samuel 31 verse 6, so Saul and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men died together that day. Hello, Saul and his 3 sons died together. 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 23, David writes a song about Saul and Jonathan when they're dead, and he says this: Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and gracious, and in death they were never separated. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. So their friendship was never fulfilled because life is complicated, and secondly, because people are cruel. Let's just now grab this nettle. Are David and Jonathan gay? All right, you go online, you listen to gay theologians, you read what gay Christians write, and there are gay Christians, and this is one of the major things they'll focus on. They'll look, for instance, at what David writes about Jonathan. When Jonathan has died, David writes this lovely song about Saul and Jonathan. I just read you part of it. Let me read you the next part of it. 2 Samuel 1:25. This is David writing, and it was a song. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. He's talking about a mountain. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. Listen to this. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. And David was an expert on the love of women. And he's saying that Jonathan's love for him and his love for Jonathan was better than the love of a woman. So you can see why people suggest, are these 2 guys gay? My answer to that is, do with it what you want, absolutely not. One of the things I love about the Bible is that the Bible gives honest pictures about people. It doesn't give sort of airbrushed versions of people. It shows you what they're really, 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 really like. And there is no hint in anywhere in Scripture that these 2 guys are having sex together. You know, whenever we talk about people loving one another today, the problem is we immediately assume that means having sex together. You know, I am sick and tired of watching movies where 2 people are kind of interested in each other, and the first thing they do to show that they're interested in somebody else is finish up in bed with them. That is not how you develop a deep relationship with somebody. It really isn't. It's how you screw your life up and how you screw their life up. There is no hint that these 2 guys are sexually involved, but people may have suggested it because people are cruel. Now, in the last couple of minutes, let's really get down to brass tacks. Have you realized yet that if you are going to be a key player in the purposes of God, there will be some friendships that you cannot develop? There will be some things that you cannot do. Let me just put some heads on nails. Let me talk about that in my life, all right? Remember what I said, a commitment I made. I'm never going to stand up here and just spout rubbish at you or stuff that, oh yeah, that's great, that's what everybody believes, blah, 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 blah. And I know in my heart it doesn't work. I'm trying to be real. I fell in love with somebody I wasn't married to. Okay? I didn't go looking for that. And in some senses, that was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to me. Rob, how can you say that? I'm just telling you the truth. Nothing happened physically. And we both decided, and it was the hardest thing we ever did in our lives, to go away from each other and never see each other again. Why? Because I actually believe the Bible. And I believe that when I stood on December the 28th, 1968, and made a promise to my wife, and she made a promise to me, we meant that. And I'm glad that I made that decision to walk away. But listen, what's that done for me now? I've had to analyze me. You know what I found out about me? There are certain things between Barbara and I that are not fulfilling. Barbara is not kind of an intellectual or an academic, all right? And so I yearn to be able to talk to people about theology and doctrine and all the rest of it. And I've discovered it is highly dangerous for Rob Whittaker to meet with a woman who's really smart, loves Jesus, and have her as my best friend. It don't work. And so there are areas of my life that are empty. And it's part of the price tag of walking with Jesus. There will be some of you here who are gay. And you'll have a really difficult decision to make. Rob, what do you mean by... What do you mean when you use the word gay? Because the word's used in a variety of ways. I mean, you are emotionally and sexually attracted to somebody of the same gender. You know that's the best fit for you. You know that's how I'm hardwired. Now, you will hear people say there is no evidence that people are born with a gay orientation. They don't know what they're talking about. There, I've said it. There is a huge amount of biological evidence and research, and if any of you want to talk to me about this, I'd love to do that. You hear people come along and say, that's not true, that's okay. Well, ask them how they explain all the evidence that I'll tell you if you're interested in. But if you're gay, as a Christian, you have a choice to make. Do I live with loneliness in certain areas of my life, or do I just go against the statements of God in Scripture? That there is a price tag that comes with being a key player. And for David, part of that price tag was the heartbreak, the literal heartbreak of an unfulfilled friendship. David also suffered the trauma of spiritual attack. It's mentioned in 1 Samuel 18, but it's mentioned lots of times. In addition to that, or sometimes, lots of times an exaggeration. It's mentioned sometimes, although it sounds as though when you read the text it happened quite a lot, where an evil spirit from God comes upon Saul. And one of the results of that is he starts throwing javelins at David and trying to kill him. David is quite literally targeted by the enemy. Now, just a couple of minutes. What is this about? How could you have an evil spirit from God? What's that about? I mean, is God schizophrenic or what? God has set David aside as the future king of Israel, and yet an evil spirit from God comes upon Saul, and when that happens, he's trying to kill David, and he almost kills him on a number of occasions. David, in one of the Psalms, says, there's just a step between me and death, as the javelin keeps spinning past him. There's just a step between me and death. Do you remember what we said? That's why your understanding of the will of God is so important. Whatever your understanding of the will of God is, try and answer this question. What the heck's going on here? I would suggest that we read the statement, an evil spirit from God, as though the evil spirit was sent by God, as though God is initiating this attack on David. It does not say in Hebrew an evil spirit sent by God. It says an evil spirit from, and the idea is from the location of God. Do you remember? Job, Satan, comes from the presence of God. Do you remember we looked at God's permissive will? Simon, Simon, Satan has requested permission to sift you like wheat, and I've given him permission. And it seems to me that this is not something that God is initiating, but something that God is allowing. Go back to all the stuff that we looked at on the different aspects of the will of God. God is allowing this evil spirit. He's not the architect of this. And you'll find that even this evil spirit that's being allowed to come upon Saul and nearly kill David is one of the ways that God gets the king out of the boy. It's one of the ways that God grows David in his trust in God, even though he's now quite literally being targeted by a spiritual enemy. You want to be a key player? That's the next little bit. For every new level, there's a new devil. Now, we don't have time to look at some of the other areas where David suffers. I urge you to download this lecture, because you'll see on the slides there are another area, a major area, that David is finding life extremely difficult. But I want to honor the time. It's 20 to 11, so we have finito bonito. See you later.